In this lesson, I'll show you how to sculpt your own objects from scratch using the motion controllers, which will come in handy because Cuthbert has managed to get himself stranded on a distant platform again. Fortunately, we can use the tools in sculpt mode to help get Connie to Cuthbert and escort him to safety. Before starting this tutorial, I'd recommend you complete Start Dreaming for motion controllers if you haven't already. It'll get you up to speed with all the basic controls so you can focus on becoming a sculpting master. First, make sure that you're sitting comfortably in front of your PlayStation camera. Now hold the Start button for a few seconds to calibrate your imps. Next, hold the T button on your secondary motion controller to open the assembly menu. Use your primary imp, the one with the face, to open the Modes menu with X. Then select Sculpt Mode. Its icon is some three-dimensional shapes. Release the secondary T button to close the menu. Every time you enter Sculpt Mode from the Modes menu, a new sculpture will be created. You'll also notice that when you're in Sculpt Mode, everything outside the sculpture will be blurred and grayed out. You can adjust visual feedback in your preferences, which you can find in the Options menu. Before we start sculpting, use the Move buttons to reposition your view so you can see the first two platforms and the whole gap between them. Now you need to set your imp reach. If you stretch your arm out in front of you, you'll see your imp doesn't reach the platforms. Setting your imp reach to the platforms will put them within reach of your arms. Hover your imps on either side of the first platform, the one with Connie on it. Tap both Move buttons at the same time to set your imp reach. Now you can reach the platforms with your imp. Setting your imp reach is vital for sculpting. Set it to something large and you'll be able to sculpt huge shapes in the scene. Set it to something small and you can work on tiny details. Once you're in position and have set your imp reach to the first platform, you're ready to start the next step. When you first enter Sculpt mode, the Shapes menu will open automatically and the Smear Shape tool will be equipped to your imp. The Smear Shape tool is great for sculpting organic structures, so we should probably pick an appropriate shape. Hold the secondary T button to open the Shapes menu, then select a shape with your primary imp. To resize the shape, hold the secondary Circle button. While holding the Circle button, tilt or twist your secondary controller in either direction to resize up or down. Release the Circle button to stop resizing. Now position your primary imp next to the platform, on one side of the gap. Hold down the primary T button and use your imp to smear shapes into the gap and create an organic structure. You can undo and redo using a gesture on your primary controller. Point or twist the primary controller to the left, then press its square button to undo. To redo, point or twist your primary controller to the right, then press its square button. Or you can undo and redo using the buttons in the Tools menu. Each time you press and hold the primary T button, you'll create a new edit within your sculpture. Bear in mind that all the edits you make are part of a single sculpture, even if they aren't connected. This means that in assembly mode, they'll behave like a single object. Why not try out different shapes to see what works best? Maybe try making something like a rock formation or a tree trunk. If the video ever gets in the way of your sculpting, remember, you can grab and move it with the primary T button. When you want to try out your sculpture, switch to play mode and walk Connie around on it. Once you're happy to move on, go back to edit mode, rewind time in the assembly menu, and proceed to the next step. What happens when we want to edit an existing sculpture rather than start a new one? Let's investigate. When we went into play mode, we were taken out of sculpt mode. Now you're in assembly mode, so to edit your existing sculpture, you'll need to scope back into it. Scoping into a sculpture is exactly like scoping into a group. Hover over it with your primary imp. Hold the secondary triangle button, then press the primary X button. Scoping into a sculpture automatically puts you into sculpt mode. Now we're here, we can edit the shapes we've made. To grab and move shapes, first press the primary circle button to unequip the smear shape tool. Unequipping any tool automatically equips the move tool to your imp. Try grabbing and moving parts of the sculpture with your primary imp. To clone a part of the sculpture, hold the secondary triangle button. Then grab whatever you want to clone with your primary T button. You can also resize the shapes you grab. Just hold the circle button on the secondary controller, then tilt or twist that controller to resize the shape. If you want to add to your sculpture, just open the Sculpt Tools menu using the secondary T button. Select a shape with your primary imp. This will equip the last sculpt tool you were using. Try sculpting with different shapes. Remember, you can undo and redo at any time. If you accidentally scope out of your sculpture, just hover over it with your primary imp. Then hold the secondary triangle button and press the primary X button to scope back in. In the next step, I'll show you how to color your sculpture. You've probably noticed by now that all your sculptures are orangey brown, like clay. That's the default color, but you can sculpt with any color you like. If you're in assembly mode, scope back into your sculpture. Hold the secondary triangle button and press the primary X button. Open the Sculpt menu by holding the secondary T button. In the Sculpt menu, use your primary imp to open the Color section. Select a color group to reveal more shades. Now choose a shade. And as if by magic, the shape on your imp is now the color you chose. Any new shapes you make will be that color, but the old shapes are still brown. Luckily, we can also color shapes after we've created them, using the spray paint tool. Open the Sculpt menu and select the Tools icon with your primary imp. Then select the spray paint tool, which has a spray can icon. Now your imp will have an outline of the current shape on its tip. Intersect the shape with your sculpture and you'll see the spray paint color appears on it. Hold the primary T button to spray paint the shapes. Use different colors and shapes to completely change the look of your sculpture. There's one very important difference between sculpting with color and using spray paint. Self-colored sculpture edits will keep their color when you move them, but if you move a spray-painted edit, the color stays behind. So if you're going to spray paint, it's best to wait until you've finished sculpting. You can also change the finish of your sculpture using the Finishes menu. Try out the Coat, Style and Effects tutorial if you want to know more about finishes. Take some time. All these smeared shapes are creating one single sculpture, even if there's space between them. But you can also use the smear tool to remove from the sculpture instead of adding to it. To do that, we need to make the tool subtractive. Scope into your sculpture if you haven't already, and make sure you have the Smear Shape tool active. You can equip it in the Sculpt Tools menu. In the Sculpt menu, find the Add or Subtract button. It's next to the Tools button, and the icon is a shape with a plus sign on it. Select this button with your primary imp to make the shape you're using subtractive. You'll notice that your imp turns into an outline. The shape on your imp becomes an outline too. You can now use the Smear tool to cut into your sculpture. Try using different shapes to see what effect they have. For a really cool effect, try subtracting with a different coloured shape on your imp. How good is that? You can switch between additive and subtractive using the button in the Sculpt menu. But if you're like me, you probably don't like wasting time in menus. So I've designed a gesture that will quickly switch between additive and subtractive tools. Here's how you do it. Touch the glowing sphere on top of your secondary controller to the bottom of the handle on your primary controller. Easy as that. Touch it again to switch back. Experiment with the tools for a bit and make something that looks interesting. When you're happy with its shape, go into play mode and see if you can get Connie across it. When Connie has crossed the first gap in play mode, switch back to edit mode and rewind time. Move your view over to the next gap using the move buttons, then start the next step once you're in position. Smearing shapes can be a messy business. Sometimes you just want to create neat sculptures. Luckily, there are ways to do that. Go to Sculpt mode via the Modes menu to create a new sculpture. In Sculpt mode, you're equipped with the Smear Shape tool by default, but this time we're going to use the Stamp Shape tool instead. Its icon is a simple square. Select it with the primary X button. You can also quickly switch between the Stamp and Smear tools by pressing the primary triangle button. Stamping shapes is a bit like stamping objects from the Dreamiverse. With the Stamp Shape tool, you only stamp one shape at a time, no matter how long you hold the primary T button. We're going to practice sculpting an architectural structure over the second gap, which gives me an opportunity to show you a powerful new technique. Earlier, I showed you how to resize shapes in a uniform way using the secondary circle button. But you can also resize and reshape in an organic way using another gesture. Simply touch the glowing spheres of both controllers together while holding a shape, and you'll be able to organically resize and reshape it. We call this form. Manipulate the shape by carefully moving your imps in relation to each other. You'll see the shape changing in all 3 dimensions depending on where you hold the controllers. Make a shape that goes all the way across the gap. When you've got the shape the way you want it, press the T button on the secondary controller to equip the shape to your primary imp. You can now use this shape to sculpt with. Don't forget, you can undo by twisting your primary controller to the left and pressing its square button. Practice using form with different shapes to get a feel for this technique. Sculpt a simple bridge using Stamp Shape and form. This is just a practice run though, so don't spend too much time making it fancy. When you're ready, move on to the next step. If we want to make a super neat bridge, there are a couple of guides we can use. First, let's delete our practice sculpture. So if you're still in Sculpt mode, go back to Assembly mode. To leave a mode, hold the secondary triangle button, then press the primary circle button. Once you're in Assembly mode, delete your sculpture by pressing the primary triangle button as you hover over it. Now go back into Sculpt mode via the Modes menu to start a new sculpture. The guides we're going to use are called Mirror and Grid Snap. Open the Sculpt menu, then select the Guides button. Now select Mirror and then Grid Snap using your primary imp. They'll open to reveal some options. The plus and minus buttons next to the Grid Snap button set how fine or coarse the grid will be. The number indicates its current setting. You'll see a white dotted grid in the scene. The dots will be closer together when it's finer and further apart when it's coarser. Leave it set to 1 for now. You can experiment with it later. Now select the Stamp tool and choose a color and a shape. The mirror guide will always center on the first shape you make. That's why we started a new sculpture. Use the move buttons to position your view so you can see the whole of the second gap. Then set your imp reach to one of the platforms. Now stamp your first shape in the middle of the gap to activate the mirror guide. You'll see the mirror plane appear. This can't be moved once you start sculpting. You'll notice that it's much easier to keep your shape straight and in line. That's because Grid Snap is active. It even helps you rotate precisely. With Grid Snap on, objects rotate 45 degrees at a time. Sculpt your bridge from the mirror plane to the edge of the gap where it meets the platform. Your edits are mirrored, so you only have to make half a bridge, and it will be nice and symmetrical. Carry on sculpting your bridge using additive and subtractive edits and different colours. This time, you can make it as fancy as you like. If you want to switch off the mirror guide at any point, I've got another gesture you can use. Take both your motion controllers and lightly touch the bottom of their handles together to toggle the mirror guide off or on again. When you finish sculpting your bridge, test it out in play mode. When Connie is across the second gap, return to edit mode via the options menu. Switch off mirror and grid snap in the guides menu. In the next step, we'll sculpt the last bridge, so use the move button on either controller to get yourself in position. Then start the final step when you're ready. To sculpt the last bridge, we'll be using the mighty stamp tool again. First, we'll need to create a new sculpture by going to Sculpt mode via the Modes menu. Now that you're in Sculpt mode, make sure you've switched off the mirror guide before you continue. You can also switch off Grid Snap if you want to. Hold the secondary T button to open the Sculpt menu. Select a shape and colour for your sculpture. You'll be equipped with the Smear Shape tool by default, so you'll need to switch to the Stamp Shape tool. Don't forget to use the shortcut. Press the primary triangle button to switch between Stamp Shape and Smear Shape. Use Form to make a simple bridge. Forgotten the gesture? Just touch your controller's spheres together. Press the secondary T button to confirm your shape. Next, choose a sphere from the Shapes menu and select a new colour for it. Now move the new shape right next to the bridge so that they're touching. If your imps are in an awkward position, you may need to recalibrate them. Just hold Start on either motion controller until the imps snap to front and center. Right, this is where your sculpting skills move up a notch. With your shape just touching the bridge, hold the square button on the secondary controller and twist it away from the primary controller. The more you twist, the softer the blend will be. Stamp the soft shape with the primary T button. It's amazing, isn't it? You can make some really intricate and bizarre shapes using Soft Blend. Soft Blend only works with the stamp shape and spray paint tools. So if nothing's happening, you probably still have the smear tool equipped. Just press the primary triangle button to switch to stamp shape. You can also use Soft Blend on subtractive shapes. To switch to subtractive sculpting, touch the sphere of your secondary controller to the base of your primary controller. Try using Soft Blend with the spray paint tool. It's great for blending colours. Experiment with different shapes and blends on your bridge. See what you can come up with. Bear in mind that you can only blend shapes that are part of the same sculpture. When you finish sculpting the bridge, try it out in play mode and get Connie to Cuthbert. Take Connie through the door to finish the tutorial.
Hello, I'm Kareem, Art Director of Media Molecule. Today I will be doing a sculpture masterclass. I'll be modeling a male bust and going through basic modeling techniques to block the general form of the sculpture and build up to more detailed techniques and more sculptural philosophies and attitudes to find your own personal style in Dream. I hope you find it inspiring for you to start sculpting and find your own style in Dreams. And now we begin sculpting our head. The first phase is to block out the general shape of all the head and bust components. Here we go. This is a sculpture pedestal that I've made earlier for the purpose of this tutorial. Also, I've made the space around us and put in it some of my favorite sculptures for inspiration and reference. I've also pre-lit it with nice lights to help us sculpt in a nice atmosphere. Before we start the sculpture, I would like to recap that it's very important to have learned the camera controls. In the Dream tutorials, you will find tutorials just focusing on the camera controls and tells you all about the different nuances of it. The most important one is the grab cam, where pressing your move button on your primary controller will grab the point in space that your imp tip is over. This is the imp tip on top of the imp here. So if I put my imp wherever I want to go, press the move button, pull myself towards that point or push myself away, you see that the camera is moving accordingly. It's very important to have practiced this in order to proceed with the sculpt tutorial. There is also other features in the camera like zooming, which makes you zoom in right close to an area in order to work on very fine detail. I would recommend that you practice using the camera controls now, and when you feel confident in them, click the arrow on the video to go to the next step. The first thing I'm going to do is open my sculpt menu by pressing the T button on my secondary controller. I will pick the modes and choose the sculpt mode. Sculpt mode defaults on shapes. The shape I'm going to start with is the sphere shape. When I start pressing my T button on my primary controller, I can smear my shape continuously like that. This is the tool that sculpt mode defaults in. Instead, I'm going to change to stamp shape tool, which allows me to stamp singular stamps of my chosen shape. This is the tool I'm going to start with in my sculpture. Now I need to stretch my sphere shape. To do that, I'll use form. I tap my two controllers together, which puts me into the form state. Once I'm happy with that, I press the T button on the secondary controller to lock the shape that I've stretched, something like that. Now I need to turn on some guides to help me place my first edits. To do that, I will open my menu again, press the guide menu and select the Stay Upright guide. Pressing that fixes my shape to upright position only and doesn't go in any other orientation. By pressing the second toggle beside it, it allows it to only rotate by 90 degrees only, like this. The next guide I'd like to enable from the start of my sculpture is the mirror guide. This allows me to work in symmetry, which is very useful for modeling ahead. To do that, I will go to the guides, enable it, and this activates the mirror guide, which places a copy of every edit I do. This is very useful in modeling ahead. You can see the mirror plane as well is drawn in the center. I will switch that off because I prefer modeling without. Now to place my first stamp, I'd like to get my two mirrored copies exactly aligned on top of one another. To do that, I try to get that center line aligned as much as I can. When I do that, I press the T button on the primary controller to place my edit. For the second edit, for the back of the head, I will turn my shape by 90 degrees and press the T copy here, modeling without. This is very useful in modeling ahead. You can see the mirror plane as well is drawn in the center. I will switch that off because I prefer modeling without. Now to place my first stamp, I'd like to get my two mirrored copies exactly aligned on top of one another. To do that, I try to get that center line aligned as much as I can. When I do that, I press the T button on the primary controller to place my edit. For the second edit, for the back of the head, I will turn my shape by 90 degrees and intersect with the front of the head. I would like to also blend that shape onto the first one more softly. To do that, I will activate one of our other features called the soft blend. To soft blend, I press the square button on my secondary controller and twist my hand like that. This allows my shape to blend with the previous shape in a softer way. And when I'm happy with the blend amount, I press the T button on my primary controller to stamp my shape like that. Move on to the next step when you're ready. Hello, I'm Kareem, Art Director of Media Molecule. The first thing I'm going to do is open my sculpt menu by pressing the T button on my secondary controller. I will pick the modes and choose the sculpt mode. Sculpt mode defaults on shapes. The shape I'm going to start with is the sphere shape. When I start pressing my T button on my primary controller, I can smear my shape continuously like that. This is the tool that sculpt mode defaults in. Instead, I'm going to change to stamp shape tool, which allows me to stamp singular stamps of my chosen shape. This is the tool I'm going to start with in my sculpture. Now I need to stretch my sphere shape. To do that, I'll use form. I tap my two controllers together, which puts me into the form state. Once I'm happy with that, I press the T button on the secondary controller to lock the shape that I've stretched, something like that. Now I need to turn on some guides to help me place my first edits. To do that, I will open my menu again, press the guide menu and select the Stay Upright guide. Pressing that fixes my shape to upright position only and doesn't go in any other orientation. By pressing the second toggle beside it, it allows it to only rotate by 90 degrees only, like this. The next guide I'd like to enable from the start of my sculpture is the mirror guide. This allows me to work in symmetry, which is very useful for modeling a head. To do that, I will go to the guides, enable it, and this activates the mirror guide, which places a copy of every edit I do. This is very useful in modeling a head. You can see the mirror plane as well is drawn in the center. I will switch that off because I prefer modeling without. Now to place my first stamp, I'd like to get my two mirrored copies exactly aligned on top of one another. To do that, I try to get that center line aligned as much as I can. When I do that, I press the T button on the primary controller to place my edit. For the second edit, for the back of the head, I will turn my shape by 90 degrees and intersect with the front of the head. I would like to also blend that shape onto the first one more softly. To do that, I will activate one of our other features called the soft blend. To soft blend, I press the square button on my secondary controller and twist my hand like that. This allows my shape to blend with the previous shape in a softer way. And when I'm happy with the blend amount, I press the T button on my primary controller to stamp my shape like that. Move on to the next step when you're ready. The back of the head is a little bit too long. To modify the shape, I go to my stretch tool, grab the back of the head, and move it inward like that. Now I need to change to subtract to suggest the jaw shape. To do that, I will pick a different shape, the cube, and press this button up here to change to subtract. This allows me to cut out shapes instead of adding them. There is also a shortcut to toggle between adding and subtracting, like that. From now on, I will be using this shortcut. I place my cube at the bottom of the head to cut the jaw shape, and I need to scale this cube up a little bit. To do that, I use the controlled scale, which is pressing the button, the circle button on the secondary controller, and twisting my hand upwards like that makes my shape bigger or smaller. Notice that the upright guides are still on, which makes my shapes still upright. I'll do this first cut here for the first shape, and then go on the back of the head to create the back of the jaw shape. Always remember to press the move button and move your camera around to keep examining your edits, that they are what you need them to be, just like I'm doing here. This is roughly what I'm looking for. Then I press the T button. Now the shape of the head is starting to form. When you're happy with your shape, move on to the next step.